Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the press conference on the EU climate law. Thanks for taking the time. We have planned to finish at 12 o'clock. This panel, this press conference we've foreseen to have 3 short interventions from the panel, and then open up for questions from your side. I want to introduce the panel briefly. So to the right side, that's Klaus Röhrig, working for the Climate Action Network, and he's doing policy coordination on climate and energy policy. On my left side, Sebastian Mang, working for Greenpeace Europe office here in Brussels, and he's climate policy advisor. My name is Imke Lübbeke. I'm working for WWF, European Policy Office, based here in Brussels, and I'm leading the work on climate and energy in this office. Yeah, we have, as I said, 3 interventions. I will start giving a bit of the political context of this EU climate law and the importance of aligning policies. Klaus will talk about the role of the 2030 target and the importance of that in the EU climate law, and about the scientific body, and Sebastian will talk about the role of governments and political actors in the EU climate law debate. And he will also briefly wrap up. Yeah. So starting a bit of background and political context of the EU climate law. You very likely remember when Ursula von der Leyen was nominated as president of the EU Commission, she quickly committed to actually have the first EU climate law, to propose the first EU climate law. And she mentioned that she was inspired by people on the street, the young people on the street, and that it actually touched her heart, and she wants to respond to that movement. This is great. We always welcome that. And she also mentioned that this will be a flagship of the European Green Deal. And we know already that this, and Timmermans, Vice President Timmermans confirmed that, and even went a step further by saying it can't be only about 2050 and the long-term objective. It can't be an empty shell. It needs to deliver much more. This is actually what we are waiting now for, to see what is it, what can we expect from the Commission, and we got a hint of what the EU climate law could include over this weekend from a Financial Times article. But we today want to actually make sure that you know what we see as priority and necessity of this law to do and to deliver. And I'm just showing this 12 points paper published by WWF and Greenpeace together, setting out the key asks, the 12 key asks for this law. So back to the law itself. We know what we know about the law. We know it will enshrine the long-term objective, which is an agreement of all EU member states to reach net zero emissions by 2050. That has been agreed in the European Council in December, but it is important that we will find that enshrined in EU law. Why? It will guide the policy directions and it's a very strong signal to investors. It's a necessary condition, but as mentioned, it's not enough. We need more. And I want to focus on one key element, which is the consistency element. We want this EU climate law to make sure that one hand actually, both hands contribute to reaching the net zero objective and the shorter term targets. That means all policies, new policies and existing policies, contribute to reach our targets. I give an example. We've just seen the agreement on the PCI, projects of common interest list, on gas projects, translating into 29 billion euros investment into gas. This is exactly what we don't want to see if we have a climate law. We actually want to make all policies contributing to reach that objective. So policy consistency. Other examples are, we know the common agriculture policy could contribute to reaching that goal. We could avoid having bad practices financed and supported by the common agricultural policy, and increase their contribution, the contribution of farmers of these sectors to reaching that goal. And a last example on what is not consistent yet and what needs to be reached is the bioenergy policy, actually incentivizing the use of biomass while not securing that the greenhouse gas reduction target is reached, and that biomass use is in line with our climate targets. And these things need to be aligned, and we want it, and we ask for a strong principle, making sure that this consistency is in the law, which would actually, for us, the biggest outcome and assurance that we get where we want to be. And just one recent example, or one very topic, an example where we can already prove whether we get what we want is if we see the industry strategy, where we want to see an alignment with the net zero objective. I hand over, leaving the consistency issue, hand over to Klaus, talking about the 2030 target.
Yes, thank you, Imke, and welcome everybody. Yes, exactly. So I'm just making a bit of a reference to what we can expect and what we want from the EU climate law. You've maybe have read the article in the Financial Times that also Imke referred to. So we actually are looking into, or we expect that there might be a delegate kind of transfer of power for the EU Commission to propose delegated acts on the EU climate targets, which is definitely a good step, but we have to see if it will survive co-legislation. In addition, there was also reference to a review mechanism of the targets, which would be crucially important because we need to align the review of targets with the Paris mechanism every 5 years to increase the targets upwards. But of course the question is still, will those revisions be science-based? And this is what we need, because we are at the moment very disconnected from the requirements what scientists ensure. And then secondly, we understand that this review only applies to the targets post-2030, so it would be 2035, 2040, which of course is a good step. But we also know from science that what is really mattering for the achievement of the Paris Agreement goals is immediate action and the very urgent 2030 target revision. So this year, 2020, we know is the most important year for climate action since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And you know that in Paris, all countries agreed to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And they did this in order, because they understood that going beyond 1.5 degree global warming would come with tremendous damage and costs on human civilization and global ecosystems. So it is this year, the UN climate conference in November, until all parties to the Paris Agreement, including the European Union, have to resubmit new increased 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction commitments, the cornerstones of the Paris Agreement. So we expect that the EU climate law will mobilize power to actually revise these targets, the 2030 target of the European Union. And this is the EU's most urgent and most important homework to do this year. So if the European Commission is serious about addressing the climate crisis, they need to ensure two things. One, aligning the ambition level of its targets with science, and second, getting the timing right and ensuring that the EU is ready for COP26 in November. First, on the ambition, it appears, as Imke also mentioned, long-term target will be in the EU climate law net zero emissions by 2050. But for a 1.5 degree target contribution, the EU should actually achieve net zero much earlier, by 2040. Science also tells us, as I mentioned, what is really crucial to keep the 1.5 degree target attainable is immediate and short-term action. So for the EU, this means setting a target for 2030 of at least 65% greenhouse gas emission reductions. This is well beyond what the Commission has also promised, the range of 50 to 55%. This demand, 65% greenhouse gas emissions, is also in line with science and in line with the recent United Nations emissions gap report that has called for annual reductions of 7.6% in global emission reductions between now and 2030. For the EU, this would mean 65% emission reductions by 2030. So we have to start taking science seriously. This would also mean ensuring that the mechanism to review the targets is anchored in the EU climate law, and that a review is really science-based. And for this, we would also need the establishment of an independent scientific advisory body that can monitor and assess progress towards emission targets and then suggest evidence-based targets for the EU in the future, starting with the 2030 target. The second issue is on the timing. So if the Commission's current plans are only to propose a new 2030 target later this year, we heard also, I think it was mentioned in the Financial Times article as well, maybe September, and the target will be a range of 50 to 55%, this is far too little and far too late. The EU needs to build momentum before COP26 and have to agree on a new target for 2030 well before COP26. For this to happen, the EU Commission now needs to come forward with a proposal as soon as possible. Actually, we expect also today or tomorrow a letter from at least 10 European member states that will call the EU out and also ask the Commission to speed up the timeline on this. I'm now handing over to Sebastian. Thanks.
Thanks. So Europe has the power to affect global change. We are seeing that it will depend on whether Europe will actually commit to the necessary reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, whether countries like India and China will follow suit. With Trump in the White House, who else but the EU will take the lead on reducing emissions? However, the problem is that with the EU's response is that what it calls politically unprecedented is in fact woefully insufficient if you compare it to the science or the challenge that the climate emergency represents. So linking climate science with the targets after 2030 is a good step, but as long as the 2030 target is not in line with science, we're not meeting the Paris Climate Agreement. For too long, governments have been delaying or opting for too little, and we are seeing the same patterns now. Governments like France, the Netherlands, and Denmark are still arguing for targets that are not enough for 50. They're arguing for targets that are not enough for the Paris Climate Agreement, and this is the case even though countries like Denmark and Finland have national targets that are actually in line with 65% or in line with the 1.5 target. So why are these countries not arguing for science-based targets when nationally they already have climate targets that are in line with this? On the other hand, countries like Poland and Czech Republic are arguing for the radical position of not needing to increase the targets at all. and this would cause complete oblivion to our ecosystems and to our society. But of course, and the European Parliament is also going to be asking for more than what the Commission is. It needs to also be asking for more than what the Commission is suggesting. We've got the Greens and GUE who are arguing for climate-based targets, and the S&D kind of split, not voting in favour of the higher targets. But the climate law needs to do more than just set targets. We have countries like Denmark and Finland who have national climate laws, and these climate laws nationally have a lot more depth than what we were expecting from the European Commission's climate law. We're expecting countries like Denmark and Finland to be arguing for the most important parts of their national climate laws to be transposed to the European level. This includes things like the Climate Science Advisory Body that Klaus was talking about. This includes things like yearly progress reports, so that you can check whether governments are actually achieving the targets. In the Parliament, we're also expecting that the governments are in the Parliament, we're also expecting that the groups will be asking for more than what the Commission is suggesting. The S&D and the Greens want a lot more than what want a lot more depth to the climate law. The Greens, for example, will be asking for a fossil fuel phase out. If you look at the Sustainable Investment Plan for Europe, or the Green Deal Investment Plan that the Commission proposed earlier this year, there's a lot of questions there, because they continue to allow for investments into gas and industrial agriculture. So these kind of inconsistencies that the climate law, so that the EU policy includes, needs to be phased out, and the climate law should be that vehicle to affect this change. Other political groups like Renew, led by Canfin, are eager to rush through the climate law, but this, of course, may mean that some of the important elements that we would like to see in the climate law will not make it to the final draft. So, in summary, banking heavily on the 2050 target with no measures for 2030 or weak measures for 2030 will mean that governments skirt action now. And as we know, this is what's really important. All you need to consider is that BP and Shell support the net zero target for 2050. And yes, net zero is the finishing line, but the climate law must be the starting gun. We need urgent action now. This means that we need to have science-based climate targets for 2030. We need to have consistency. That means that the worst subsidies, like subsidies for fossil fuels, industrial agriculture, are phased out. We need that all sectors contribute to the targets, and we need a scientific body to make sure that governments are held to account.
Yes, thanks, Klaus and Sebastian. I think we move to taking questions from you on the points we've raised, but also other questions you might have. Please say your name and the media you're working for, or organization.
Thank you. Is this working? I'll just speak anyway. I'm Jennifer Rankin from The Guardian. How concerned are you that the coronavirus might distract the EU from the Green New Deal, the Green Deal, from all things climate? You've already heard some comments in this direction that the EU now needs to focus on the coronavirus, and and equally thinking ahead to the Glasgow COP, could that also be a problem there as well?
I collect another question and then give it back to the panel. Yeah.
Dave Keating for Forbes. Just a question on the delegated acts, this idea of being able to review without having to put forward a new law and go through a lengthy negotiation. Are you sympathetic at all to anti-democratic arguments about that idea that the target would be revised up without going through a legislative procedure and approved by the citizens?
Thank you. Sorry, there was another hand there. Yeah.
Sorry. Anna Huber from Context. I've got a question regarding the post-2050 sort of target that is also mentioned in the article of the Financial Times, that they might want to impose also another objective. Can you tell us more about this, and what is the big difference between this and the 2050 target?
Thank you. We want to take the first one.
Yeah, sure. The coronavirus is obviously a big threat, but the climate emergency is equally one, and the EU would have to deal with both of them, and obviously the UN. If you want to answer that question, you can. It's a difficult one. I haven't quite made my mind up what this is going to be like.
I think what we can say is very important for the 5-year cycle comes to an end with the Paris Agreement decided in 2015. It's important that all the parties gather and come to a conclusion, whether this is end of this year or early next year, if it would need to be postponed. But I think there is very clear commitment also from the EU and all our parties to actually conclude and to put forward the pledges and to reconfirm the Paris Agreement. And I think the UK is a very strong leader. They have committed themselves to make it a good COP, and I think they will do everything possible to make it happen. And that's actually what we wish for, because we all know time matters. So it's important that we actually get pledges, that we get renewal of commitment, that we share best practices, that the climate rule book will be finalized. There is a lot at stake, and I think the UK government, supported by the EU, this is what we understood, will make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we should not underestimate the possible delaying power of the coronavirus, but at the same time, we should also not use it as an excuse of not delivering on the deadline and on the kind of important commitments that Imke also just mentioned under the Paris Agreement. Should I maybe quickly say something on the second question about the democratic concern of the delegated acts? So, well, actually, this is the way that targets are currently set is also behind closed doors in a body that is absolutely not integrated into the decision making of the European Union, that just gives political guidance, and we have a bit of a hijacking of such an important decision about the climate targets. And we see that at the moment this setup leads to the way that the targets that are being discussed are absolutely not in line with science. So we have nobody actually, as Seb just explained, we have nobody in the European Council defending a science-based target of 65%. That is not the case. So if we actually can get a move that would kind of take it out of the hands of heads of states only, and of course there will also be, as we understand, the possibility to override a delegated act with a 2/3 majority from the Council within, I think, 2 months. So there will be a mechanism also to control the Commission. This is definitely an improvement. So the question is still, how can we ensure that the targets that will be set by the Commission if that will be if it will survive the co-legislation, etc., if that might become the way that targets will be set, how can we ensure that those targets are also scientifically informed? And that still remains a question mark.
Maybe just on that. So that's where the scientific advisory body comes into play. So if the climate law, like most national climate laws, includes a climate science advisory body that is staffed by independent climate scientists and other experts, comes forward with a target that the EU should achieve, and that this target is then put into a delegated act and follows the procedure that Klaus explained, then the climate targets can be more science-based, and this would be a good step. But this process should really start now, because as we know, that the 2030 target is really the make or break for the Paris Agreement.
And responding to the third question about the removals and the target after 2050, so I think it's hard to comment. We haven't seen a leak of the climate law, so I can't comment on that. But I think the point you are making is about the removals, and we should start removing carbon now with as much as possible we can. But the point you are referring to is that if we reach net zero, it's not an end point. We need to increase removing and continue to remove carbon out of the atmosphere, and at that point we remove more than we emit. And what that rate should be, I think that's the point you are referring to. But I can't give more comments because we haven't seen the exact proposal. Yes, please.
Consoli from Asca News, Italy. I would like to ask two questions. One, can you please explain to us the rationale behind the idea of a European law on climate? Why do we need a law on climate? Why all the means that have been used until now in climate policy are not enough? Do you agree with the Commission that we need this? And the second thing, have you seen the draft? Does it contain also stuff concerning transport, biofuels, hydrogen, CAP, this kind of thing? What do you think about this? I mean, it looks like I'm afraid that if you concentrate just on asking more, knowing that the situation is very difficult in the Council and in the Commission too, with the lobbies, etc., then you will not get that. And what about the rest? I mean, these other technical, perhaps, things that can be achieved more than a highest objective.
Yeah, question here, over here, Mark. There, here's a question.
Hi, thank you. Florence Autrey from the Swiss Daily, La Tribune de Genève. When the net zero target was agreed at the Council, we also that Poland was quite reluctant, and because they have a large part of the electricity produced by coal, obviously. But when you look at Germany, which was in the same case, they just began their transition out of coal, I mean, in the 70s. So. And they have spent hundreds of billions to alleviate notably the social consequences of this. So my question is, do you care at all about the consequences of this very big change that you are supporting? How do you deal with the budgetary aspect of that, knowing that member states have constraints? And Poland is not Germany, obviously. So do you care at all?
I give it a start and then you add. So your question on why an EU climate law. An EU climate law is the way we understand it and see a value of it, is that the 2050, the long-term objective, is enshrined into law, meaning providing the long-term direction. We will, however, only reach that target, that objective, if we have all hands on deck. That actually means all sectors, and that has been well shown in the long-term clean planet for all vision the EU Commission has published last year. end of 2018. So all hands on deck. What does it mean? We need to have a piece which brings all the pieces of legislation and all the efforts we see in several sectors together, and also includes those sectors which have not yet been involved, notably industry and agriculture. Two sectors which have been not part of or left out due to the target given in 2011 with the roadmap. They have been not really affected, and so meaning we need to look at the whole picture. What can be done? How can everybody contribute? And that's about the governance we need. So we've mentioned the long-term objective. Obviously, if we know we want to be at net zero in 2050, we can't start thinking about what to do in 2040. We need to start now, not only because these changes take long time, but also because we know already it's cheaper, we know the timing matters, and the next decade is so important. And the other thing is we can't afford, because we care about the consequences, we can't afford thinking only on single issues. We need to think the whole piece together. And that's actually, we need to understand what one hand does and can't ignore that the other hand is undermining it at the same time, because we have scarce resources, which is money, which is time. So both hands need to work together. And this is what the climate law should deliver, consistency and a push into the direction which actually heads of states endorsed in December. And the elements we are suggesting below that are key features to make that happen. The consistency, the scientific body, and other elements we've suggested. Just one word as well on the do we care? Yes, we care. That's why WWF has engaged very early on in discussions about how actually can we make a transition in just transition mechanism, and in 4 concrete projects in Greece, Bulgaria, Poland and Germany to understand what actually are elements of a successful transition. Happy to share the recent report which has been published, and this report shows that Germany has spent a lot of money on the transition without actually being very efficient, very effective, because what was missing as a key element of this transition was an early commitment to the phase out, which means the long-term direction and the end date was not clear. It could be, you can see that if clarity is provided to regions with regards to this is a running time of the installations, orientation early on goes to other options, and people start to engage and develop alternatives. That was not the case for the German region, and one of the evaluations made by the people who carried out an assessment was that this was actually lacking. Clarity of when is a phase-out date and when does the region need to orient to new alternatives, as just one element. But I leave my colleagues to contribute and add to
maybe
what
just
I said.
maybe just also to add. I mean, of course, we understand also that the climate transition is one of the biggest social challenges overall. But I mean, our kind of conclusion would be we should not then just ignore what has to be done in terms of the climate scientific impact, but actually that politicians should be more honest and should be more clear about what is the direction of travel. And I think this hasn't been communicated strong enough yet. And that's exactly where it is so important to be honest about what are the target levels that are required, and then to identify what are the social challenges that might arise from this trajectory, so that we can actually have a well-managed transition. And there, I mean, we come exactly into the place where the climate law could be a beneficial tool, because then we could also identify, for example, those elements of the financial architecture that we have that are in total contradiction to the direction of travel at the moment.
I'm just going to say a couple of things. One is, so the Green Deal, one of the big problems with the Green Deal is that it does not suggest the economic transformation and does not suggest social policies like the Green New Deal policies do in the US or by other political groups or by others in different countries. And what's important about the Green New Deal is that it's about investing into the future. It's about thinking about the social elements, and this is exactly where the Green Deal fails. It doesn't suggest the economic transformation that is needed, and so if it was up to us, we would be investing much more heavily into the transition. We'd be investing much more heavily into a just transition and making this economic transformation that is needed a lot more socially fair. And by setting the right targets and allowing for sufficient time between now and the right targets, we can also make sure that that it is done in the fair way. But if we now set insufficient targets and then wait until 2 years before the deadline and then suddenly ramp them up, then this is going to be massively socially unjust. So it's about rethinking the way our economy works and rethinking the way we do the transition. And so we think that we care a lot more than the Commission and the way that the Green Deal is being set up right now.
Other questions?
Thanks. Robert Hodge, Men's Europe. What's the single most important signal that you hope to see from the Environment Council on Thursday this week in relation to this? Because it seems to me that it's national governments basically that are the most serious obstacle to raising ambition. So I'll leave it at that.
So there's going to be a letter being sent today or tomorrow by 10 or 11 governments calling on the Commission to bring forward the timeline for the 2030 target. And basically the Commission wants to present the 2030 plan to increase the 2030 target in September, but we would like to see it a lot sooner, specifically before June. And this is what a bunch of governments, 10 or 11 governments will be saying. So we're hoping to see that the Environment Council repeats this message and gives a clear signal to the Commission that what is needed is that the climate targets for 2030 are proposed in a timely fashion, so that Europe can definitely go to Glasgow with a new set of plans for 2030 that will persuade others to do the same.
I was wondering something with regard to the UK's decision regarding Heathrow, and a bit regarding your comment about mainstreaming climate policy and making sure that there's consistency across the board. Do you think those member states, and there's still quite a lot that haven't set a 2050 climate neutrality goal, might be discouraged by some of the potential legal challenges that setting a 2050 goal on EU level might create, or pushes as yours to mainstream legislation? I mean, you've already mentioned the PCI list. I mean, it kind of opens the door to legal suits, and the UK showed that climate policy can be successfully used to kill infrastructure projects. So do you worry that essentially the more people realize what setting a target means, there might be more pushback to actually setting that into law?
Thank you. On this letter, how do you know there's a letter from the governments? Do you have it? And which is the 11th country which is hesitating?
You want to?
Well, we know it's the Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Spain and Portugal. Countries like that will be supporting the letter, but the letter will be made public by the countries themselves. So I'll let them do that and won't say any more.
But you saw it before the Commission.
I have not seen the final letter. I just know it's happening.
Yeah, exactly. So we actually expect the same countries that have also signed a letter in October on the 55% support, but we expect this letter to be specifically about the timing and timeline. Yeah, so maybe today or tomorrow. Yeah, on the legal uncertainty, I mean, I would say all countries have agreed, also ratified the Paris Agreement. So this is not that the European Union is now implementing, of course, the Paris Agreement into its legislation, but actually these steps are providing legal certainty. So I mean, we would definitely see that we have a political backing from the European Council in December on the climate neutrality target by 2050. The question that's still open is the effort sharing between those targets, between the member states. But we would definitely say now the steps to move forward also on national level to go towards climate neutrality as soon as possible is a consequence also of the ratification of the Paris Agreement. So we would actually see this is a step basically to ensure their legal honoring of their commitments under Paris. I don't know if you want to add something.
Definitely difficult cases. I'm not familiar with the details of that, but we can see this period now that the commitment to the climate neutrality is there. So we have a period of aligning decisions towards that. That requires considerations around procedures of infrastructure projects going ahead under this objective, and I think that's exactly what needs to happen. The consideration of, is that the right investment if we want to reach the net zero objectives, and that requires more discussions in sectors that triggers exactly those inconsistencies. And I think that's what we need to have, and it's not like done from one day to the other. It's a process. This is a transition. What are the right investments? We need to have these discussions. It's a broader political discussion and requires backing at different levels. It's not a one decision in Brussels. We see all these contradictions, and it's great if it triggers down. And hopefully we can inform and get to good decisions under social aspects, environmental aspects, and see the backing from the leaders actually, which discussed exactly that at the December Council. What are the consequences? What is the how? How can we do it? We move to the how, and that is where we need to go, and the how is not always as straightforward. So I think we can expect more of these cases, but it doesn't leave us and shouldn't leave us question the overall objective. It just means we are in the middle of a transition, and that's good. Yeah. Thanks all for great questions. I realize time is over, and you might, if you have other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. It was great having you around. We also have circulated some written input to the debate, and thanks so much for taking the time and for joining us. Bye. Have a nice day.